Hello and welcome to Sipz and Stories. My name is Elizabeth, and in today's video I will be doing my wrap-up catch-up. So as I was putting together this video, I realized that a lot of the books I had to talk about were books that were feminist books or girl coming-of-age stories or featured very strong female characters. So in today's video I will talk about a lot of these girl power books that I absolutely love. Many of them, of course, are classics. So grab your favorite beverage as I discuss my wrap-up catch-up. The first book that I would like to talk about is The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford. This is my gorgeous folio edition, which I talked about in my spring TBR. If you'd like to see some close-up shots of this book and the beautiful illustrations throughout, I will link that video below, but I finally polished it off and I absolutely loved it. This was my first Nancy Mitford, but it will definitely not be my last. It's absolutely adorable and hilarious. She is exactly what everyone says about her. She is funny, irreverent, just off the wall crazy. And the fact that this book is loosely based on people that she knew in real life, including her father and her sisters, just makes it that more interesting. If you're unfamiliar with The Pursuit of Love, it is about two cousins, Fanny and Linda, and they are growing up in this very crazy aristocratic family. Their Uncle Matthew is crazy, and there's just all these like weird things that happen as they're growing up and going to debutante balls and parties at Oxford and things like that. So Fanny is basically the narrator of the book, and she kind of takes the straight and narrow path. She gets married, she has kids, very easygoing. Linda has a crazy life. She ends up bouncing from one disastrous relationship to the next. At one point, she becomes a communist, and so I think that is Nancy Mitford's subtle nod to her sister Jessica. I love this book. It was excellent, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. If you like The Pursuit of Love, I highly recommend watching the television show on Amazon Prime starring Lily James. That show got a lot of mixed reviews, and I think what was happening is that people that didn't like it probably have never read the book. You need to have some sort of understanding of Nancy Mitford's writing style, her sense of humor, and just kind of maybe a little background knowledge of the Mitford sisters in order to appreciate that show. Otherwise, you're just gonna think it's Lily James splashing around in a bathtub, which for some people is not a bad thing. That being said, I really enjoyed it. I liked how they took the book and kind of gave it a more modern twist with some of the music and some of just the settings and the characters. A lot of it really relates to some of the social issues in our own time. I loved it. It was fantastic. But now that I've read The Pursuit of Love, I wanted to find out more about the Mitford sisters and the Mitford family, which leads us to our next book. And that was, of course, The Sisters, the Saga of the Mitford Sisters by Mary S. Lovell. This is kind of one of the leading biographies in print right now about the Mitford sisters. Trust me, it is not the only one out there, but I would say it's probably the best and the most widely read. So I really don't know where to start with the Mitfords. Talking about them is like talking about the history of the early 20th century. All I can say is that I find them fascinating, and for me they're just kind of like the final missing piece of the puzzle of the early 20th century. So not only were they related to the Churchills, they were related to the Kennedys. They were this very big aristocratic family that had the 6 daughters. So kind of like a real life version of Downton Abbey, just a whole lot crazier. They're most famous for being on opposite sides of the political spectrum. 2 of the sisters, Diana and Unity, got really involved with the fascists and Nazi Germany. They were even friends with Adolf Hitler. Those scenes in the book are absolutely fascinating. So as horrifying as Hitler is, of course, it is interesting to see what his life was like and what his social circle was like through the eyes of these young 20-year-old girls that knew him. And so Diana in particular is the most interesting because she's kind of like this socialite in London. One day she's having tea with Hitler, and the next day she's having tea with her cousin Winston Churchill. Unity is probably the most crazy of the Mitford sisters. She famously shot herself at the beginning of World War II. And then my personal favorite Mitford sister would probably have to be Jessica. Jessica was the card-carrying communist. She ended up running away with her first husband to the Spanish Civil War. Then she immigrated to America, and she lived where else? In San Francisco. Francisco, and she got involved with a lot of social causes here in the United States, including civil rights and abortion and just a lot of issues. She was a very prolific writer herself. Her most famous book is probably Ons and Rebels, but she also did a lot of political writing as well. And then even the youngest sister, Deborah, is fascinating. She is famously the Duchess of Devonshire, and she preserved, her and her husband, the Duke, preserved Chatsworth, which is a very famous home in England that they preserved for the public and for future generations, especially during World War II when it was the most at risk. So you might be familiar with Chatsworth. It's in a lot of Jane Austen movies. There is a lot to be said about the Mitford sisters. This book is fantastic, and it's just a great jumping off point. Now I wish that someone would turn this into a television show. I think it would be fascinating. I'd also like to call up Ken Burns and see if he can make them into a documentary. I think there has never really been a great documentary about them because of their political differences. But I love this book and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read recently was Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris by Paul Gallico. So obviously I read this one in anticipation of the new movie that is coming out next month. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be delightful. But this book has been on my TBR for quite some time, Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. In fact, I think over 20, 30 years ago, Angela Lansbury made a movie version of this book as well, so I'd love to go and watch that movie too. But if you are unfamiliar with the story, it's delightful. It is about this older woman. She is a cleaner in London, and she just kind of is poor. She goes from house to house cleaning up after all these very wealthy people. And then one day she just kind of has this coming to Jesus moment. She finds this Dior gown in the closet of one of her clients, and she is just in love. She has never seen something as beautiful as this dress in her life, and she is determined that she is going to buy a Dior dress of her own and go to Paris and just have the time of her life. She doesn't realize though until she talks to the client that Dior dresses cost hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and so she ends up spending 2 years saving for this dress and this experience in Paris. And the beginning chapters are hilarious, just all the things that she does to save the money for the dress. She ends up going to the racetrack and gambling, and just her and her friends. It's delightful. So she does. She eventually gets over to Paris to buy the dress, and no one, of course, at Dior takes her seriously. She's this poor, older woman, and she doesn't realize that in order to buy this couture dress, she's going to have to stay in Paris for a while it's altered and fitted to her specifications. One of the employees at Dior volunteers to let her stay with him for the week while the dress is being altered, and there's just this really sweet romance between one of Dior's models and this employee at Dior, and Miss Harris kind of gets involved in it. It's a delightful, very sweet book. Now that I read it, I cannot wait to go back and watch the movie. And I do recommend, don't just watch the movie, go back and read the book, because Paul Gallico's writing is so charming and so witty. And this is part of a whole series. So I think there's Mrs. Harris in New York, Mrs. Harris in Berlin, and I just cannot wait to read more of his books. He also, oddly enough, wrote Thomasina, the very famous children's book as well, that was turned into a Walt Disney movie about the little sick girl and her cat, Thomasina. I really like Paul Gallico now, and I'd like to read more of his books. The next book that I read was The Bookshop by Penelope Fitzgerald. This book has also been on my TBR for quite some time. A lot of my favorite booktubers love this book, and I was quite curious about it because, as you know, my ambition is to start a bookstore, so of course I was drawn to this book. But now that I read it, oh man, this is not the book to read if you want to start a bookstore. It's a little depressing, I won't lie. A lot of people compare Penelope Fitzgerald's writing to someone like Muriel Spark. I would say now, having read this book, she does remind me a lot of Muriel Spark and the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. She does also remind me of Barbara Pym, Excellent Women. So really good writer, but really dark sense of humor in this book. I'll just tell you right now, it doesn't end well for poor Florence. What is it about? It is about this widow. She decides to take her retirement money, move to this seaside coastal town in England, and open up a bookstore. And she thinks, of course, she's going to bring some culture and books to this town, and they will love her and they'll embrace her in her bookshop. Well, that doesn't exactly happen. They kind of end up resenting her for opening this bookstore. Like, they have no use for books. Why didn't she open up a library instead? Why aren't the books for free? I mean, God forbid someone make money selling books. And then a lot of the town's busybodies just end up getting involved too and trying to put her out of business and trying to take over the house where this bookstore is being run. And so she's feeling really depressed and not sure what to do. She does end up befriending the town's recluse, this rich old man who kind of lives alone, kind of like a hermit. And so he suggests that she begin selling Lolita. And so Lolita came out in the 1950s when this book was set, and it kind of caused a sensation, obviously. And so she gets some customers that are curious about Lolita, but unfortunately not enough to save her. And so I won't tell you what happens at the end, but it's not good if you want to open a bookstore. That being said, the sense of humor in this was really good. Penelope Fitzgerald's writing is really sharp, not witty like I really enjoy, but very, very dry, like toast dry, bone dry, like gin martini dry. I liked it, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of her books because she was a very prolific writer. This book was also turned into a movie not too long ago, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. So now that I read it, I would like to go back and watch that movie as well. I enjoyed it and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And the next book that I read was Graceling by Kristin Cashore. I read this one with my YA book club. This is kind of considered a YA classic now. It's at least 15 years old. I am old enough to remember this one when I was in high school, so that's how old this book is. I really enjoyed it. I'm so glad that we read it at last. This was such a good book, such a great feminist story, girl power book for young girls. So much of what I'm reading in YA right now, I don't 100% agree with. I'm not sure where YA is going. Sometimes it feels like it's all going in that Margaret Atwood direction. And I just kind of wish it would kind of come back to this like girl power hero stories again. That's how much I loved Graceling. So what is it about? I'll just read you the back cover because this is what made us pick the book for book club. Katza has been able to kill a man with her bare hands since she was 8. She's a Graceling, one of the rare people in her land, born with an extreme skill. Again, once we all read that back cover, we were like, heck yes, we're gonna read this book. Many feminists in that book club. And it didn't disappoint. We really enjoyed it. So yes, Katza has this gift. She's basically a killer. And unfortunately, her uncle, the king, uses that gift for his own personal gain. And he kind of sends Katza all over the kingdom to take care of his dirty deeds and put people in their place. And so she's kind of having a lot of reservations about this, about being this kind of hired killer. One day on one of her adventures, she meets the handsome Prince Poe, and he kind of teaches her that, you know, you don't have to go in this direction. You can use your gift for good as well. Great story, great characters, and the writing. Kristin Cashore's writing was excellent as well. I think if you're a person that thinks that YA is beneath you, try a book like Graceling. You might be surprised. You might actually enjoy it. I love this one, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And finally, to wrap things up, I read a couple more books that featured very strong girl coming-of-age stories. 2 of these I mentioned on my spring TBR, and I'm so happy that I did read them and polish them off. The first, of course, is Heidi by Johanna Spyri. As I said in my spring TBR, this is not the first time that I've read Heidi. I read it a long time ago when I was in elementary school, so I forgot half the story. And it was really fun revisiting this classic as an adult. That's why I love children's classics, because I think when you're an adult and you're around a lot of kids yourself, you have more appreciation for these stories and these characters and the moral lessons that they're teaching. I love children's books today, but I still think there is a place for books like Heidi. I really want to preserve these classics for future generations. If you're unfamiliar with the story, you've probably been living under a rock, but I'll just refresh your memory. It is about a young orphan named Heidi that goes to live with her grandfather in the Swiss Alps. And he is this very gruff, cantankerous man who has distanced himself from the rest of the town and the community. And he ends up falling in love with Heidi, just her sweetness. And then one day when she is taken away from him and she's sent to live with this family in Frankfurt, Germany, he's just heartbroken. The whole town is heartbroken. time. But of course, the people in Germany love Heidi as well. And so that ending where everyone reconnects, it's such a sweet, simple, beautiful story. The setting too, again, in the Swiss Alps is beautiful. The goat herds, Peter, grandfather, grandmother. I love this book. And finally, the last book that I read recently was A Girl of the Limberlost by Jean Stratton Porter. This is another one that I mentioned in my spring TBR. And again, I am so happy that I read this book at last. It really represents everything I love to read. It's a classic, it's a girl coming of age story, and it is excellent writing. I loved this one. It reminded me a lot of basically two of my most favorite books, The Yearling by Marjorie, Kinnan, Rawlings, and then something like Betsy and Tacy or Anne of Green Gables. So the Yearling side of this book is just the excellent nature writing. This book is set in Indiana and in the woods, in the swamplands of Indiana where Eleanora grows up. She ends up collecting all these bugs and butterflies and moths and using them and flowers and insects to pay for her way through school. So the story starts off, Eleanora really desperately wants to go to school, but her mother is dead set against it, and she will not help Eleanora. She won't pay for books, she won't pay for new clothes. So some neighbors kind of help Eleanora get started, but she has to go out into the woods and collect these specimens like moths and butterflies and sell them to local naturalists in order to pay her way through school. And it's just beautiful. The nature writing in this is stunning. And then those scenes at the high school where she's meeting other girls and growing up are delightful. Those are the parts of the book that remind me of Betsy and Tacy. The best character in this book is probably the mother. Her transformation from this very mean woman, this cantankerous woman, to this just loving soul at the end of the book is really just the heart of the book. At first, you don't know why she's so dead set against Eleanora going to school, but after some secrets are revealed, you kind of feel some compassion for her, what she's been through, and her transformation is the best. Actually, I kind of preferred it to Eleanora's story. It also has a very sweet, light romance as well. Again, similar to something like Anne of Green Gables. I'm so happy that I read this classic as well. It's very underrated. Cannot recommend it highly enough. And I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Thank you for joining me for my wrap-up catch-up. I loved all of these books. They were just really great, excellent girl coming-of-age stories and girl power books like Graceling, and some very feminist texts like the Mitford sisters. Again, cannot recommend these books highly enough. Thank you and have a great day.